Ready. So, in response then to Anthony Hirst, I've entitled this short paper, Some Ottoman Reflections on the Conquest of Constantinople. And I don't claim huge originality for this paper, it's more a synthesis of some of the anecdotes and so on that were going around at the time. Also a synthesis of some of the interpretations of what was happening at the time, with a number of my own ideas mixed up with it. And I'm very interested in the way the conquest is presented. If you talk to a Greek, it is a disaster, black and white. And I think generally in the Orthodox tradition that would be the case. But I think a closer look at some of the Ottoman sources reveals a much more nuanced picture, and one which is certainly worth considering. And one which I think in the development of perception goes some way to explaining some of the attitudes that we have towards Byzantium today. Okay, so I'll kick off. In 2012, Istanbul saw the debut of a spectacular film, Fethi 1453. Fethi means conquest. Constructed like a Hollywood epic of the classic period and eating up a colossal budget, the film purported to narrate the conquest of the Queen City by the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. The purpose was, of course, to resurrect a sense of national pride in a specifically Islamic and Ottoman past, and to celebrate the martial Ghazi, or warrior tradition, of the early Ottoman sultans, and to suggest by implication that such a spirit was at last returning after decades of supposedly secular republican aridity. By stressing the religious value of the conquest, as a piece of political propaganda, it ideally suited the Islamic zeitgeist, depicting what is arguably the most important event in Ottoman history. The film, in fact, narrated the events of 1453 as the culmination of Islamic religious ambition, bringing to life the famous hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, "They shall conquer Constantinople, glory be to the prince and to the army that shall achieve it," and interpreting the fall of the city as a religious event. Now, that hadith, you may have seen, is actually on the wall of Hagia Sophia. Did you notice that? Well, it's very interesting. That's much a later edition, and it's not the first time that hadith has appeared, but significantly, as you come out of Hagia Sophia under the great mosaic of Justinian and Constantine, on the door jamb, that hadith has been placed on a carved marble slab. So that's quite a significant thing in itself. Okay. The film indeed seems to suggest that the fall of the city was in fact inevitable. The Byzantines were corrupt and decadent, most definitely unbelievers, and indulging themselves in a court that at times seemed more appropriate to the Julio-Claudians. The Ottomans, meanwhile, were tough, manly, ambitious, filled with religious and so righteous zeal, and inevitably victorious. After all, they were fighting for what was morally right. In a scene derived from an anecdote in the Seyyad Haname of Evliya Çelebi, Ak Şemseddin, the supposed spiritual advisor of the Sultan, says, as he pins an aigrette to the Sultan's turban, "You have become the chosen prince of the House of Osman. Continue to fight valiantly in the path of God." There must have been many in the audience who came out of the cinema at the end of that film and gazed on the mosque-studded skyline of Istanbul and felt that it was all worthwhile. But history is rarely as simple or as comforting as that. An examination of some of the prominent personalities around the Sultan at the time reveals a much more nuanced picture that highlights a set of contradictory attitudes towards Byzantium and a tangled skein of real anxiety as to how the heritage of the Byzantines, and specifically of Constantinople itself, should be approached, handled, and assimilated. Akshemseddin himself, as a prominent religious figure, is a good place to start. He was the main preacher in the Ottoman camp during the siege of the city, and after the breaking of the Ottoman blockade around the city on the 20th of April 1453 by ships that brought aid to the beleaguered city, he sent a letter to the Sultan addressing the resulting crisis of confidence. After all, such a reverse must have reminded Mehmet of his own father, Murat II, who abandoned a blockade of the city in 1422 after the failure of a single assault. In this revealing document, Akshemseddin questions the Islamic resolve of the Sultan. Tactfully, he writes that he feels that there is insufficient religious resolve in the army for the siege to succeed, and he points out that the army is comprised of renegade Christians. This is quite subtle. On the surface, he means the Janissary corps, but they were a small part of the total forces amassed. After all, there were many soldiers of fortune and hunters of glory who flocked to the Sultan's standards. By implication, Akshemseddin also implies those advising the Sultan, men such as Zaganos Pasha, Ishaq Pasha, and Mahmud Pasha, all of whom were also of Christian origin and who maintained contacts with their places of origin. Clearly, if he was representative of the religious in general, there must have been misgivings over the appropriation of an overtly Christian site and a questioning of the Islamic authenticity of the Sultan's imperial ambitions. This can be illustrated by a story. Mehmet invited Akshemseddin to take over a tekke or dervish convent by the city walls. The scholar refused and told his son that he would be returning to his tekke in Asia Minor, as Constantinople caused him to lose his sense of spiritual inspiration that only returned in the more traditional uplands of Anatolia. But there is a further twist to the story, again involving Akshemseddin. For centuries, the tomb of the Prophet's standard-bearer, Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, who underwent voluntary martyrdom in the siege of 674 to 678 under the Umayyad Caliphate, had been shown to Muslim visitors to the city just inside the city walls. It's not actually clear now where it would have been, so we're not quite sure where this putative site might have been. Akshemseddin, during the siege of 1453, showed that there was an alternative tradition and that Abu Ayyub was apparently buried outside the city walls near the head of the Golden Horn, today's Eyüp Sultan. After the conquest in 1457, as the Islamic nature of that event became clearer, Mehmet built a fine mosque there with dependent foundations, including a dervish convent. It must have been the directorship of this foundation that Akshemseddin refused, implying that there was still doubt in his mind as to the real motive behind the Sultan's acts. Was the conquest the result of imperial ambition, coming from a man who aimed at self-glorification at the head of a renegade army, or was it really for the glory of God, in the spirit of the saying of the Prophet Muhammad, a saying which interestingly, Akshemseddin refrains from quoting. It is only later, when Mehmet has decided to make Constantinople his capital, as opposed to Edirne or Adrianople, that he builds a great mosque designed to upstage Hagia Sophia and inscribes the hadith quoted above over the entrance, inscribing it for the first time on a structure in the city. One feels that the Sultan's own attitudes to the city, his own relationship to it, and his ideas as to its future were all evolving as the meaning of the conquest itself became clearer. Akşemseddin felt uncomfortable with the city itself and its identity. Other members of the educated elite later seem to have shared the same ambiguous reactions to the conquest. Tursunbek, a historian who wrote a famous work, the Tarikh-i Abul Fath, played down the conquest and represented it as the personal achievement of the Sultan. But he was writing during the reign of Mehmet's son, Beyazıt II, who frequently expressed open disapproval of many aspects of his father's life. The renowned historian Ashik Pashazadeh went further and claimed that the conquest allowed Christians greater influence at the Sultan's court, singling out the vizier Rum Mehmet Pasha as an egregious example, claiming that he actually acted against Muslim interests as a form of revenge for the fall of the city. Ashik Pashazadeh was an Anatolian, of course, a dervish and a Ghazi warrior. He did not exactly oppose the idea of conquest, because that itself was in the Ghazi tradition, but he had his doubts as to the changes in polity that it brought with it. Examples could easily be multiplied. In fact, it took a very long time for the idea of the conquest and its results to become acceptable as the city gradually acquired a more specifically Muslim identity. By that time, Akşemseddin was long dead, and his own story had evolved into that of a man who was the spiritual inspiration behind the conquest, a role that most would see him in today. At that time, Akşemseddin was not the only one with misgivings concerning the city, and those close to the Sultan. Chandarli Halil Pasha had been Grand Vizier under Murat II and represented the force of conservatism in the Ottoman court. Indeed, in 1446, he had frustrated the attempts of younger Christian converts at court to put Mehmed on the throne. He remained powerful and was still Grand Vizier when Mehmed finally succeeded to the throne in 1451. Chandarli Halil Pasha stood for the older Ottoman status quo, in which the power of the Sultan was balanced by the interests of the leading families and warlords of traditional Anatolia. He came from such a background himself. According to this model, the House of Osman presided rather than dominated the powerful elite and led as leader of a Ghazi state. Mehmet's own father, Murat II, had always been careful to maintain this balance and kept a simple court at Edirne and at Bursa, whilst campaigning effectively on the Danube frontiers. But the court was changing nonetheless, as members of the slave administration, formerly Christians, recruited from the Sultan's Christian domain, and rising to the top through a mixture of merit, ambition and ruthlessness, was beginning to become more powerful and to have a greater say in the administration of the state. These were the men who grouped themselves around Mehmet and expressed their ambition through a wish for the conquest of Constantinople, surely the most glorious of all victories. For men such as Chandarli Halil Pasha, this was unacceptable. The conquest would lead to a far more imperial form of government and an increasingly remote and autocratic sultan concentrating his power in the palace. The balance that had existed before would be damaged, and the focus would inevitably shift to the west and away from Anatolia. It is one of the ironies of history that Mehmet's Grand Vizier Halil Pasha would in fact probably have favoured an independent Constantinople. Michael Angold sees the shift in policy to one of conquest as nothing less than a ferocious power struggle in the court, driven by new men, eager to break the power of older men and to move themselves into the vacuum thus created. After the conquest, it seems that Mehmet himself was unsure what exactly to do with his new possession. It was, for example, by no means clear that he was to make the city his capital from the start. The palace he built on the site of the Forum of Theodosius was a makeshift affair of pavilions and gardens, more suited to be a temporary residence than a permanent administrative structure. And he continued to reside in Edirne, only visiting Constantinople when necessary. And Edirne was, of course, well situated to function as a base for further operations in the Balkans. Indeed, in the discussions that followed the conquest, Chandarlı Halil Pasha had suggested that Constantinople should actually remain autonomous under the leadership of Lucas Notaris. Those around Mehmet could not allow this solution, which would have been to allow the conservative Anatolian faction ascendancy in court. They acted swiftly and decisively. Notaras was executed after implicating Chandarlı Halil Pasha, who was himself beheaded without further ado. In his misgivings, Chandarlı Halil Pasha was in fact remarkably prescient. By associating Constantinople with a change in the power structure, with a more imperial and autocratic court, with a rise in Christian influence, he was anticipating what actually happened. Once he had settled on the idea of making Constantinople his capital, Mehmet moved his palace to the Acropolis of ancient Byzantium, in the incomparable site where it now stands, and he made it the centre of a powerful bureaucracy based on slave recruits from his Christian dominions and limited access to himself. The old Anatolian families thereby declined in influence, and the government was dominated by a breed of ruthless and extremely able men, answerable only to the Sultan, and taking care of the families and communities from where they came, and of a network of connections stretching over a substantial part of Europe. Well might Mehmet recline in magnificent isolation in the Topkapı Saray, and contemplate the city which straddled two continents and gave access to the sea, joining east and west. Well might he inscribe on the gate of his new palace that construction was undertaken by the command of the Sultan of two continents and the Emperor of two seas, the shadow of God in this world and the next, the favourite of God, the ruler of land and sea, the conqueror of Constantinople, father of victories and conquest, Sultan Mehmet Khan. As the idea of Constantinople as an Islamic capital of empire developed, so Byzantium and its aura created an imperial world order based on a bureaucratic autocracy very different to anything the Ottomans or any other Turks had experienced before. What then of those ministers and advisors around the Sultan who pushed for conquest? These were men who were products of the forced recruitment policy, the devşirme in Turkish, the pidomatoma in Greek, that played such an important part in the important role in the creation and running of the Ottoman state well into the 18th century. Mehmet's succession to power had not been easy. He was young and powerful interests were at work all around him, but he had the support of a faction at court centred around precisely these men. Once they are in ascendancy, the Sultan alone has power and other factions are sidelined. Conquest, in fact, explicitly opens the door to autocracy. Of these men, two stand out. Zaganos Pasha, later a commander at the siege of the city, was of humble Albanian extraction. Like all of these men, he had been brought to Istanbul and converted to Islam as part of his education, though to many of the Turks around him, his conversion and its sincerity will have been in doubt. Zarganos Pasha was appointed Grand Vizier immediately after the conquest and the execution of Chandarlı Halil Pasha, and seized control of the machinery of the slave administration. More interestingly of these men is perhaps Mahmud Pasha. He was a member of the illustrious Angelovic family of Serbia. He was also connected to Caesar Alexios Angelos Philanthropinos, ruler of Thessaly in the 14th century. He was connected thus to several prominent Byzantine families, and his brother Michael represented Ottoman interests in the Serbian court. Mahmud Pasha, who had arrived in Constantinople in 1427, was thus well able to make use of a wide network of administrators and prominent personalities in the Balkans, and well represents the process of assimilation of Christian elites into the Ottoman system. After all, what Mahmud and his colleagues understood was that empire did not imply conquest so much as sustainable, creative, and effective governance, something they were keen to instill in the young sultan they had backed, and something that would involve a change in attitude towards the city of Constantinople itself. In 1458, as Mehmet demolished the Church of the Holy Apostles to make way for his mosque and moved his palace to its present location, it was now increasingly clear that he intended Constantinople, rather than the Ghazi city of Edirne, to be his capital. Mahmud Pasha, who served as Grand Vizier from 1456 to 1468, and then as a second term from 1472 to 1473, was not only a distinguished naval commander and administrator, but was also a man of culture and learning. He gathered writers around him in his great palace near the Topkapı Saray, and sponsored several building projects in the city. Most notable amongst these was the construction of a fine mosque complex near the Bedesten of the covered market, with dependent institutions and a turba or tomb, which he had built in a very Anatolian style, complete with coloured ceramic decoration, proclaiming his self-identification with the Anatolian Ghazi elites, and even further back with the traditions of the Seljuks themselves and the independent emirates that developed subsequently from the dissolution of their rule. The mosque still stands and is very much alive. Together with the building projects of Mehmet, its building was a major step towards inscribing an Islamic identity on the city. But more than that, he went a long way to encourage the development of Greek communities, particularly as more settlers were brought in. This was necessarily a delicate balancing act, as the growth of the Christian population of the city was precisely what had unnerved so many of the older and more traditional elite. He particularly concentrated on the Fanar communities and brought his mother from Serbia to lodge in the monastery of the Prodromos in Petra. In this, not only was he maintaining ties with his homeland, but also in a more practical sense, restoring ecclesiastical property. He had a firm grip of what it meant to create a city, Islamic though it may have been. Possibly he was even more realistic than the Sultan himself, as he was unencumbered with the need to conciliate faction and to present himself as an authentic warrior for the faith. He rightly saw that Constantinople could only function if a reconciliation of Christian and Muslim, Greek and Turk could be effected. Significantly, this theme occurs in some of the literary works he commissioned, notably the Dasturname of Enveri, a sprawling work that not only celebrates the House of Osman and the deeds of Mahmud Pasha himself, but also the achievements of the earlier Emirate of Aydin, which is in fact what I'm studying at the moment. What is stressed in this work is that such achievements could not be possible without alliance and cooperation between the two sides. Interestingly, the fall of the city is not mentioned in this work, as it was still a contentious issue. The work is far more concerned with questions of unity. The fall of the city would only become a part of mainstream historiography later, as the identity of the new city as capital became more secure. But it is in the background all the time, as Enveri describes retrospectively just the kind of polity that Mahmud Pasha was trying to create in the present. Significantly, both Kalhondilis and Kritovoulos provide glowing references of Mahmud's mosque, and they present the results of Mahmud's policy as a force for good, injecting life and vitality into a decaying Byzantine corpse, and that is actually how Kalhondilis expresses it in a notorious passage. The Ottoman conquest is a liberation of the Greek polity from its dead Byzantine carapace, which is a very unusual view for a Byzantine writer to hold at that period. It would appear that Mahmud was indeed a driving force behind the creation of a new polity imposed by conquest, and dictated by the need to bring together the new factions of population for the working of good imperial governance on a new palace-based model. Mahmud, of course, was not acting alone. Rum Mehmed Pasha, for example, oversaw the development of Üsküdar, or Scutari, on the other side of the Bosphorus, and provided it with markets, a bath, and a fine mosque, and other patrons followed suit, and rapidly the quarters of Istanbul became covered with a network of baths, of mosques, and of dervish convents. Again, with this came a greater comfort with the identity of the city, now developing rapidly once again into a capital worthy of the name and with a vibrant population. If these men represent one way of confronting the ambiguous perceptions of the city, the Sultan himself, as the kingpin of the system, represents another. The Sultan, an intellectually minded and inquiring man, was known to be interested in matters Greek, and to have shown a lively interest in both the Christian religion and the Christian past of his new city. His conversations with the Patriarch Gennadios in the Pamacaristos are well known. Less well known is the presence of Byzantium in the palace itself. There was a flourishing Greek scriptorium, admirably described in an important paper by Rabi, producing books and other documents, particularly books and translation in those sciences such as geography that were likely to interest the Sultan. But there was also his collection of Christian relics, which may, according to some authorities, have been the remnants of the imperial relic collection itself. Personally, I doubt that. I think an awful lot of the relics have been sold on to bolster the waning finances of the imperial family. This collection, of course, disquieted many of Mehmet's more traditional associates, the Akshemseddins, who formed part of his entourage. He also collected objects of interest and related to Byzantium and displayed them in the first courtyard of the palace. The purple porphyry sarcophagi that you can see in the courtyard of the Archaeological Museum and various other objects of sculptural and historical interest were displayed prominently as part of the decor of his new palace. Spolia indicating an ownership and proprietorial attitude to the past, perhaps, but also, one suspects, a collection that reflects a real interest and curiosity. His attitude to Byzantine monuments is also interesting. Hagia Sophia was admired and protected, and remained so for centuries. Dare I say it, had it not been for Ottoman protection, it is very likely that monument would probably no longer be standing. That's contentious, I know, but architectural interventions have basically gone a long way to preserve a building which, I'm sure you would agree, according to the laws of physics, is a very improbable building, in fact, which is why it's so remarkable, of course. However, Hagia Sophia was not everything. Mehmet had endowed it with the vaks and with the property he had seized during the conquest. But when he started building his own mosque, he transferred those properties to the foundation of his new mosque, and thereby demoted Hagia Sophia to second place in the hierarchy of mosques in his capital. Not only Hagia Sophia, but columns and other relics were preserved in situ where possible, and indeed conserved, particularly in locations associated with Byzantine imperial ceremonial. The column of Constantine, the fortification and preservation of the Golden Gate, complete with the statues and spolia that adorned it, and the Hippodrome immediately spring to mind as obvious examples. By the end of the Sultan's reign, the city had changed and was beginning to get back some of its old vitality. It was still Byzantium, but an ambiguity of identity was well reflected in the conflicting attitudes we have discussed above. Byzantium it was, but now home to a culture that owed little or nothing to the structures, administrative and otherwise, of Byzantium. Change takes time, and it took the Ottoman state and its population a long time to come to terms with their complex and polysemic capital. Yet over the next 2 centuries, we can easily detect a gradual changing of attitudes. Mehmet celebrates the conquest on the portal of his mosque. The inscription can still be seen and is regularly pointed out to visitors, even if now, under a new dispensation, they can no longer read the elegant Arabic script. Writers begin to describe the conquest in more glowing terms, and the event becomes enshrined as a founding myth of the Ottoman state. By the time we get to the famous travel writer Evliya Çelebi Efendi, there is no trace of the old misgivings and doubts that accompanied the earliest years outside and inside the walls of Constantinople. Constantinople is now, in the 17th century, regularly referred to as Istanbul, or full of Islam, to translate the Turkish term, as contrasted with the land of the Franks, Kafiristan, the realm of the unbelievers. The polarization is remarkable, as it was precisely such a polarization that was applied to Constantinople itself, as opposed to the Sultan's other domains, by so many of the more conservative elements of his own immediate entourage. For Evliya, the Byzantine past is no longer deemed as threatening or as unsettling or as overtly Christian, and so therefore diametrically opposed to the Muslim ideology behind Istanbul as city, but rather the Byzantine heritage becomes something talismanic. Monuments such as the Serpent Column in the Hippodrome, the columns of Arcadius, Theodosius and Marcian, many of the older surviving churches are presented as encrusted with legend and serving as objects that protect the fabric and the population of the city. A very good example of this can be seen in the spolia on the Golden Gate of Constantinople, which is now in the Yedikule fort. Did you see that? Okay. Well, in the past it had, like the citadel of Konya, it had a number of fragments of ancient statuary studied around it, sort of decorating it. And several times European antiquarians came and tried to get hold of these pieces for their own collections, and the Turks steadfastly refused. to give these up on the grounds that should the spolia be taken from the Golden Gate, then a calamity would happen to the city, because they were historically protective talismans looking after the identity of the city itself. This is how the attitudes have really changed, I think, to the city. From threat to protective talisman is a remarkable shift, and all the more remarkable that now the Christian past has been appropriated in such a way as actually to protect a city whose population is mixed, but whose identity and whose raison d'etre is entirely Islamic. The religious scholar, the Anatolian warlord, the Devshirme boys rising through the system, and a young, ambitious sultan all represent ways of looking at the city and allow us an insight into what was challenging at the time. It seems that enthusiasm for the conquest was certainly muted, and even the Sultan himself seems not to have been very sure as to what to do with his new acquisition at first. But perceptions could be and were manipulated by a very influential and creative group of high-placed men. In doing so, they contributed significant change into how the state was to function and how the state was to be perceived by its members. Work began on Mehmet's mosque in 1463 under the direction of Atık Sinan Pasha. When it was complete, the portal proclaimed the Sultan as conqueror of Constantinople, I quote, a city that had not been conquered by caliphs or sultans or emirs. Displayed prominently under the hadith quoted, Mehmet, with a new confidence, displays his conquest as a truly Muslim act and as a fulfillment of an injunction of the Holy Prophet. The population of the city was heterogeneous and mixed, to be sure, raucous and colourful. It always had been, long before the coming of Constantine, and has remained so ever since. But the portal inscription sets the tone for the development of perception of the city's identity for centuries to come. So the film, described at the beginning of this paper, perhaps makes more sense. In the eyes of the city's people, it perhaps seems not so bizarre or mendacious after all. Good. There we go. Yeah.
Not really.